In today's presentation, I'm going to be discussing the pet breeding industry, more specifically the dog breeding industry. So if we begin with the history of dog breeding, as a brief overview, so the domestication timeline starts around 9,000 years ago, with dogs specialising in sledding and hunting. We also have prehistoric dog-human partnerships depicted in cave art from Africa and the Middle East. We also have ancient Egyptians noted to have bred at least 10 consistent dog types over the course of 3,000 years. And we also have classical influences in terms of the history of dog breeding, such as Aristotle and Xenophon in Greece documenting dog breeds and hunting practices. And we also have Xenophon's Cynogeneticus, which was considered like the early breeding guide. So to go into more depth with dog domestication and where it originated. So there was fossil evidence of dog sledding and polar bear hunting, and this was found through archaeologists finding sled remains along with dog fossils, which they then grouped into two types, one resembling today's Siberian Husky and the other the Greenland dog. And this shows that even back then, humans were already breeding dogs with specific purposes like sledding and hunting polar bears, and not just as companions like we do today. We also have prehistoric partnerships between dogs and humans, which are seen in cave art across northern Africa and also the Middle East, more specifically Arabian Peninsula. And we can see these dogs here assisting in hunts and also herding livestock. Moving on to ancient Egypt. So in ancient Egypt, there were 10 dog breeds which were kept consistent over 3,000 years. Dogs were selectively bred for guarding, herding, companionship, and also ritual symbolism and also religious symbolism as well. And these dogs weren't pets as we know them today, they were vital tools for survival. And in classical Greece, philosophers, as we mentioned earlier, like Aristotle and Xenophon, they documented these specific breeds. And the Cynogeneticus is essentially the first breeding manual, and it outlines the dog traits for effective hunting and also for effective breeding as well. And this just shows that intentional breeding strategies existed much long before modern dog shows, such as Crufts that we have today. So moving on to domestication. So Tancredi and Cardinali defined domestication as co-evolution and a mutualistic evolutionary process, meaning that humans shape dogs' genetics by favouring tameness and sociability. And we also have an example in the famous Bilev fox experiment, which showed that selecting foxes for more friendliness and sociable traits led to changes in their behaviour, but also in their body structure. So, for example, floppy ears and shorter snouts. And we also see this in dogs as well. Moving on to modern breeding. So over time, humans did start to select dogs for their appearance, not just for their function or their use as a tool in society. In the Victorian era in particular, formal breeding standards were first introduced, and this began a shift as dogs were now being bred for shows and aesthetics, and you get the more competitive era of it as well. And then nowadays, in the current era, we've moved on to the designer dog. So for example, Cavapoos, French Bulldogs, teacup Chihuahuas, anything like that, they're more bred for your Instagram look, as opposed to practical utility and use within society. So sort of elaborating on that more, so designer dogs, or designer dogs as the term, these reflect more modern consumer preferences. So for example, your Labradoodles became popular because they're perceived as cute and easy to manage, but studies actually show that many of these designer breeds suffer from serious inherited health issues, and the breeding process often skips health screening altogether. And historically, dogs were bred to help humans, but modern breeding often emphasises cuteness, so like flat faces, which is your brachycephalic dogs, small size, so like miniatures and teacups, and also your floppy ears over the health of the dogs. So we're prioritising aesthetics for our own benefit, essentially, as opposed for the dog's benefit and their health and their viability. So moving on to the welfare of dogs, this leads us quite nicely into some positive welfare contributions that we've got. So historically, as we mentioned before, dogs worked as herding, guarding, detecting scents, and also companionship. And this was a mutual benefit which was based on respect and need. You've also got emotional support dogs and working dogs that still provide much value today, especially in roles like therapy, assistance for the disabled, or PTSD support for veterans. And companion animals like dogs are shown to significantly increase and enhance mental health as they offer emotional support. They can reduce anxiety, and they also promote routine and also exercise in owners as well. Um, and vets as well are increasingly recognising the positive welfare aspects of more ethical breeding as opposed to aesthetical breeding. And when it's right, it really does benefit the human and the dog as well, instead of just focusing around the human needs. So looking at the benefits of human canine companionship. So in summary, dogs can improve the well-being for many owners across different sectors and cultures, and backgrounds as well. But the same relationship can also be harmful if the dog has been bred unethically. So for example, animals that are bred in puppy farms without proper socialisation can often really suffer emotionally and physically for life. So that leads us quite nicely onto the negative welfare implications that we've got. So just for example, so you've got respiratory issues in brachycephalic dogs. So for example, the French Bulldog. You've also got spinal deformities, ocular conditions, and birth complications in many others as well. So for example, the Bulldog, quite often they have to have caesareans as they can't birth naturally because of how much their spines have been shortened. And we have a statistic of 57.2% of dogs carrying disease-related variants, and this is associated with inbreeding and selection for appearance. So we can really see there how our own selfish intentions can actually really harm the health of these dogs. And then you've also got things such as puppy mills, or also known as puppy farms. These can be really emotionally unstable environments, and they can cause great emotional distress to these dogs, and it can cause them to be prone to aggression, separation anxiety, and also fear because they lack early life enrichment, which really just isn't fair on the dogs. And also it's not fair on the owners as well, because a lot of people don't have access to trainers or the money for trainers as well, and a lot of people do go into buying a puppy blindly, just from trends that you see on social media. So if we look at more genetic engineering and also the integrity of the dog, this is a really big ethical issue, because breeding dogs for traits such as your baby face, which is your brachycephalic dogs with the flat face, your miniature size or your teacups, this can really compromise their ability to survive, and these dogs have been so physically altered that they're not able to regulate their temperatures, they're not able to give birth, and they're not able to breathe properly without surgical interventions a lot of the time. And this isn't just unhealthy for the dogs, it's also really unnatural. And specific breeds, for example the teacup chihuahuas, they cannot survive without constant human intervention. If we move on to behavioural and emotional consequences, so as we mentioned earlier, early deprivation of social interaction, noise habituation, human bonding, amongst others as well, in puppy farms and puppy mills, this can result in dogs that are fearful, aggressive, and have really bad separation anxiety, and also just general emotional instability. And many of these dogs end up being surrendered to shelters. Moving on to the five freedoms in breeding context. So unethical breeding practices violate the five freedoms of animal welfare, and this is outlined in the Animal Welfare Act of 2006. So for example, it's the prevention of unnecessary pain, provision of food, provision of water, appropriate housing, and also being social or not social. And a lot of these animals are forced into a very overstimulating, often unclean environment, with lots of other dogs, so they don't really have the freedom to be on their own. They can't choose whether or not to play, because a lot of the times it is sort of set out as a factory, so there's not a lot of room for these dogs to move around. They're just sort of kept in cages, and then shipped into a stage home when they go for sale to sort of keep up appearances as well. And dogs from these unethical breeding setups can have lifelong trauma as well from this lack of socialisation and habituation to many conditions that they'll see in the real world. And you also get the fact of overbreeding in these sort of factory conditions is leading to increased abandonment, and shelters are already overwhelmed with dogs that were once fashionable but they're no longer trendy anymore, so people are just giving them up because it's no longer cool, and things like that. Moving on to your more designer dogs, so there are a lot of public misconceptions around this area. So, for example, your Cavapoos, they are often advertised as hypoallergenic, but study shows that this actually isn't backed up by any evidence at all, really. And these designer dogs can inherit issues from both of the parents as opposed to just one or the other, and they are marketed with misleading claims, as I mentioned earlier. Selective breeding is essentially a form of genetic manipulation, and as we discussed earlier, this is just not natural, and a lot of these dogs are suffering because of human selfishness. And we've bred away from natural selection, and along with that, their just basic autonomy as dogs, and the fact that they just can't survive without our intervention. Moving on to more ethical concerns, we've got a really big issue of profit outweighing the welfare. So a lot of people who own these puppy farms and work for these puppy farms, they operate them as if they are factories. The dogs are treated as commodities, not as sentient beings that have needs and emotions as well. And this objectification of the dogs can really lower our moral standards and can lead to widespread suffering, as we covered earlier as well. And these breeders, if they wanted to be ethical, they should really care about the welfare, but they only really care about the appearance of the dogs because that makes them more profit because it's trendy, and this really reduces the dog's chance at having a natural and healthy life. The breeding of like intentional deformities as well that are cute, this reduces their survival integrity, and is just manipulating them for no real benefit to the dog at all. So if we move on to ethical theories in breeding, so for example, we have virtue ethics. So from this point of view, breeding extremes violates the temperance, and moderation really is key. Consequentialists also would argue that intentionally causing suffering, even for a desirable appearance, is unethical, and dogs should not be sacrificed for a trend. And we also have breeders often breaching the 5 freedoms, as we mentioned earlier, so denying them the freedom of discomfort and pain, and also preventing natural behaviours through confinement and social deprivation as well. Moving on to veterinary responsibilities, so vets are on the front lines for this, so they often treat conditions caused by poor breeding, but some of them do obviously profit from it, especially in your larger businesses, as surgeries to fix brachycephalic breeds can be really expensive, and it's big business, as well as joint defects as well, so like intervention for bulldogs when they need cesareans, that can be quite expensive as well, and this can create a potential ethical tension between welfare and also economical benefit, because at the end of the day it is business, and a lot of places will prioritise their income over the actual welfare, and educating the public and advocating for ethical breeding and pushing for a better regulation. Moving on to market forces, so you can see a big drive from the consumer, so this drives the breeding and Instagram friendly pets, so your aesthetically pleasing pets. People will also buy puppies online and impulsively without doing any research, and once the dog's medical costs come up, they're often surrendered to shelters. So better public education could really reduce this demand and promote adoption instead. In terms of the economy as well, so you've also got the fact that large-scale breeders will face minimal penalties, but they'll have huge profits, and we'll go into that in a little bit more depth in a second. So in terms of your more public policy recommendations, so we could increase things such as legislative updates, so requiring mandatory health screening, and also vet sign-offs for breeders. We can increase public education, so by campaigning to debunk hybrid myths such as your hypoallergenic breeds, and also promoting adopting from shelters instead of always buying from a breeder. And you could also use QR code based breeder verification systems, and these could really prevent fraud and also improve transparency of the conditions that they're actually kept in, and the breeder's standards and licensing as well. So if we move on to the legislation and organisations around puppy breeding, so to start off with, we've got the Animal Welfare Act of 2006, which is your 5 basic needs, as we mentioned earlier, and violations of this can lead to fines or imprisonment. But the enforcement is patchy, and designer dogs can often escape regulation of this because they're not technically a breed considered by the law. You've also got your Animal Welfare Licensing of Activities 2018. So this requires breeders to be licensed if they produce more than 3 litters per year, or if they're selling commercially. They also must be licensed and star rated based on their welfare. And you've also got your Microchipping Act in 2016, so all puppies have to be microchipped by 8 weeks, and the details need to be kept current before the sale, so this can improve the traceability of them as well. We also have Lucy's Law, which is a very recent one. It came into act in 2020, and this prohibits your third-party sales, so buyers must really see the puppies with their mothers, and it's aiming to end puppy farming practices as well. Your breeding laws do differ between England, Wales and Scotland, and Northern Ireland as well. So some areas have more strict inspections than others, and this can create loopholes, especially online. But on the contrary, Scandinavian countries have much stricter licensing and enforcement, and they are much more progressed than we are in the UK. So just to summarise the gaps that we've got, so obviously your designer dogs are unregulated, and they can escape health testing. You also have the enforcement of the welfare codes is quite inconsistent, because of PAG guidelines, but we'll go into that a little bit more in detail in a second. You've also got your weak regulation, and that just facilitates fraudulent sales and also neglect. And your rational choice theory, which is essentially your breeders are driven by profit, with the low risk of penalty. So to improve on these, we should have centralised breeder registration, with mandatory health screening for all breeds, as well as stronger licensing, vet involvement and also public education as well. So as I mentioned earlier, Scandinavian countries have much stricter breeding licensing, with fewer welfare violations. So as you can see from the image above, this is an example of what they're trying to do in Scandinavian countries. So that's the French Bulldog, and on the left you can see the standard, or the breed standard for the French Bulldog, and on the right is what they are currently altering the breed to look like. So you've got the extended snout, so they're no longer brachycephalic, and this can really improve their quality of life, with how they eat, how they breathe, how they control their temperature, and also just the comfortability of them as well. So going into a little bit more detail about your PAG guidelines. So these guidelines are just guidelines. They're not enforceable, so this means misleading language such as hypoallergenic is allowed. Breeders can also claim vet clearance and health status of the dogs with little to any proof at all, especially on platforms such as Pets for Homes or Pre-Loved as well, which are quite common websites used when people are buying puppies. The laws are only really as good as their enforcement, so your hybrid and designer dogs can escape these, and there's no scientific proof around the claims that are made, such as being hypoallergenic. And the PAG guidelines really exist ultimately for advertising standards, but they're not legally binding, so it does still allow for a deceptive marketing. And as we mentioned earlier, you've also got your enforcement varying by region, and this allows unethical breeders to exploit legal grey areas and loopholes that they might be able to find as well. So in summary, you have a lot of unregulated hybrids, so anyone really can sell these and breed them however they like, with no need for screening or anything like that. And a lot of the guidelines aren't legally binding, and the enforcement is really, really lax. So in terms of organisational and ethical review, so veterinarians, NGOs and also educators really need to collaborate, as these dogs are still being bred to meet Instagram aesthetic demands, and your public education is key to shifting cultural values, from how dogs look to how they actually live and what their health is like. So some of the recommendations that we can take from this presentation would be tightening the legislation, having more educational campaigns, and also increasing the protocols in terms of veterinary screening. And the pet breeding industry really is a deeply complex sector where human desire, animal welfare, and economic interests really collide. And as these dogs have co-evolved with humans over thousands of years, today's breeding practices really compromise their health and integrity, as well as their well-being, and it's mostly driven around our own personal benefit as opposed to a mutual benefit, how it used to be. So as I mentioned, to protect the future generations of companion animals, we need to change our national breeder registry so we can track and trace licensed breeders with more enforceable regulations, even in terms of just their adverts as well. We also need to promote shelter adoption and educate customers about the potential welfare risks of each breed and different forms of breeding as well. You've got your mandatory genetic screening as well for high-risk breeds, so your teacup chihuahuas, your cockapoos and bulldogs, and a lot of your bully breeds as well. Public education campaigns as well, really, really important, because it's not only the vets, but it's breeders that can do it. It's anyone in power. So really putting more money and profits into this advertisement and this education could really be beneficial, not just for us, but for the dogs as well, more importantly. And also really need to ban misleading advertisement. So in summary, the purpose and breeding and any intentions with dog breeding has really sort of taken a full 180, as opposed to how it started off with 9,000 years ago, with them having a function and health, whereas now it's just whatever's trendy, whatever looks cool or whatever's popular, and if we think it looks cute or not, which really isn't fair for the dogs.